Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're taking a deep dive into some really fascinating source material, specifically excerpts from a YouTube video transcript you shared.
Right.
And this source, it really zeroes in on recent international interactions and, well, how certain parts of the world seem to be perceiving the United States right now.
Hmm.
So our mission, in this deep dive, it's to try and cut through the noise, pull out the key insights from this specific source about what it suggests is a shifting global dynamic.
And what other countries are apparently saying and doing in response to uh, perceived U.S. policies and maybe some uncertainty there.
Exactly. It's like getting a snapshot of one particular view of the world based purely on the details in this material we have in front of us.
And what really jumps out right away from this source is the contrast it tries to paint.
Yeah.
It paints a picture where, these are its words, everybody's at the big boy table, holding these high-level international meetings while Donald Trump is described as being all alone.
Yeah, that all alone phrase is pretty striking, isn't it? And the source does try to back that up with specific examples, which, is helpful for understanding their point.
It does.
It highlights meetings like German Chancellor Friedrich Merz sitting down with Chinese President Xi Jinping, talking about future bilateral relations.
Right, just, government-to-government ties.
Exactly. And adding to that, the source notes French President Emmanuel Macron also met with Xi Jinping for similar discussions, again, on their bilateral ties.
So you get these major European leaders meeting with China's president, according to this source.
And the source really emphasizes this contrast. It notes Xi Jinping reportedly hasn't spoken to Donald Trump, while he has spoken with leaders from both Germany and France.
Now, the source does mention Trump spoke with Putin,
Ah, right.
but it characterizes that interaction by saying Putin was reportedly mocking him and actually accelerated actions in Ukraine right after that call. That's the source's claim.
Okay. So, what are these European leaders and China reportedly discussing in these meetings, according to the source? What's the substance?
Well, the core theme presented in the material is really about tackling uncertainty. Uncertainty they perceive as being caused by U.S. tariff policies.
Okay.
And they're also talking about fair competition, reciprocity in trade relationships, basically. Making sure the rules are similar on both sides.
And the source really tries to drive home the point about the existing trade ties here. It points out China and Europe aren't just big U.S. trading partners. They have deep connections with each other, too.
Yeah, the material mentions that China-Germany trade volume alone was, $279 billion last year? A huge number. $246 billion.
That scale is definitely key context. The source also includes Xi's perspective, apparently from his call with Merz.
Right, quoting him as noting changes,
Yeah.
unseen in a century, marked by intertwined turmoil and transformation.
Strong words.
And from that viewpoint, the source says China is willing to work with Germany, guide China-EU relations, and contribute to global economic stability.
And Macron's points from his call with Xi are also detailed in the source. He apparently reaffirmed France's desire for a strong economic relationship, welcomed Chinese investments.
But also emphasized the need for fair competition. And they reportedly agreed to move quickly on that specific trade issue involving cognac.
Interesting detail.
And beyond trade, the source says Macron and Xi apparently shared the same goal for a lasting and robust peace in Ukraine, starting with an immediate and unconditional ceasefire.
Okay.
They also reportedly discussed needing a political solution for the Middle East, mentioning a two-state solution. The source notes France is co-chairing a conference on that in New York with Saudi Arabia.
Right.
And Macron also apparently welcomed China's participation in the upcoming UN Ocean Conference. So a broad agenda.
Okay, so based on all these interactions reported in the source, there's an interpretation presented about the underlying message, right?
Exactly. The analysis in this source suggests other countries perceive the U.S. as, and this is the source's specific, very strong phrasing, absolute maniacs.
Oh.
And because of this perception, according to the source, they feel they need to look towards each other for, better bilateral and multilateral relations, particularly across Europe.
So if we connect that to the bigger picture presented here, the source seems to be suggesting a kind of strategic realignment, driven by worries about U.S. predictability.
That seems to be the core argument. And it raises that question, doesn't it? How does perceived unpredictability impact not just alliances, but also, economic strategies?
Absolutely. And moving on from those high-level diplomatic meetings, the source then takes a closer look at China's focus on its own economy.
Yeah, and how it's reportedly approaching these tariff negotiations.
Right. So the source details China announcing a 5-year plan, centered squarely on Buy China, Made in China, a big push for domestic manufacturing.
Hmm.
And the source interprets this move, well, pretty pointedly, describing it as a big middle finger to Trump.
Signaling, in their view, that China is not scared and plans to, quote, double and triple down on our efforts. Again, that strong language is the source's take on China's stance.
Yeah, very direct.
The source also reports on China maybe considering a new version of their old Made in China 2025 strategy, possibly under a different name, to avoid Western criticism.
And the plan.
The alleged plan over the next decade would reportedly prioritize boosting production of high-end tech goods, things like chip-making equipment.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting with a specific anecdote the source provides about those tariff negotiations.
Yeah.
It describes a situation where U.S. officials reportedly kicked things off, suggesting 145% tariffs.
Wow.
China suggests a meeting. The U.S. then apparently lowers their proposal to 30%.
Okay.
And China responds by lowering their own tariffs to just 10% and reducing taxes on their own population.
And the source is pretty blunt about how it views this outcome.
Uh,
It characterizes it not as a deal, not a success, but, quote, a consensus called caving and a capitulation, specifically on the U.S. side.
That's quite the interpretation. And what's powerful about the source's argument here is they claim China doesn't actually seem weakened by any of this.
Right. In fact, they argue these U.S. policies are hurting U.S. industries. They specifically mention trucking and factories tied to shipping.
Why?
Because, the argument goes, a 30% tariff is still high, and the uncertainty around the policy makes businesses hesitate, which keeps shipping volumes low. It kind of backfires.
So the source's perspective is that the economic pressure intended for China is, in their view, actually hitting U.S. domestic sectors instead.
Precisely. That's the picture they paint.
It seems this shifting dynamic the source describes isn't just affecting trade, though. It also discusses some pretty significant changes happening in international travel patterns.
Yeah, and how people perceive the whole process of entering the United States.
The source points to a noticeable decrease in tourism to the U.S.
And alongside this, it describes a quiet shift happening with major international airlines. It lists Lufthansa, British Airways, Air France, KLM, Iberia, SAS, and says they are reportedly slashing routes to major U.S. cities. New York, Miami, L.A., Chicago, Vegas, places in California are mentioned.
Slashing routes there, but increasing them elsewhere.
Exactly. Increasing routes to places like Canada, Mexico, Brazil, and the Caribbean. And the source gives reasons why travelers are supposedly choosing these other spots.
Which are?
Smoother entry, better deals, and fewer political complications.
Okay, let's unpack that phrase, political complications. What does the source mean by that? That sounds key.
Well, as described in this material, these complications include the perceived risk of being detained upon arrival,
Okay.
potentially being sent elsewhere. The source mentions extreme examples like South Sudan or even a concentration camp in El Salvador. Those are the specific mentions in the source.
Wow, okay, those are extreme examples cited.
Yes. Also, having phones searched, being held in a detention center, maybe without due process, potentially being disappeared for weeks.
Disappeared.
That's the term used, and being grilled about your phone's content upon entry. The source says stories have been heard about this happening to various people, including U.S. citizens, Venezuelans, and it specifically highlights the European perspective on these concerns.
So the source frames this entire shift. The routes being cut, travelers going elsewhere by saying, quote, others are winning from this, presenting it as a direct result of these perceived entry problems.
Mm-hmm. And it does make you ask, how much can perceptions around entry policies really impact a country's tourism? And how quickly can competitors maybe capitalize on that?
That shift in travel also seems connected to another area the source highlights, this intensifying global competition for talent and research.
Right. The material suggests other countries are seeing perceived U.S. policies around universities as, opportunities for themselves.
Like who?
For instance, the source mentions Canada. Lawmakers there are reportedly considering increasing their budget, specifically to attract international students to Canadian universities.
In China.
China is reportedly investing heavily in infrastructure for its education institutions. The stated aim, according to the source, is to attract American students, other top global students, and recruit world-class professors.
The source gives a very specific example too, doesn't it, regarding agricultural research?
Yes, highlighted through some questioning by a U.S. senator that's referenced in the material. China is identified in that discussion as a country investing heavily in agricultural research, maybe second only to the U.S.
And the concern raised by the senator in the source is pretty significant. They claim China is reportedly stealing technology and intellectual property.
while simultaneously investing, quote, boatloads into their own research.
And at the same time, the source claims U.S. agricultural research facilities like a legume research facility at Michigan State Potato Variety Research are facing cuts or closures.
Yeah, and what's interesting is the source notes that apparently even farmers who supported Trump are asking for research funding to come back, just so they can stay competitive. And the senator quoted in the source frames this kind of research as essential, explicitly saying it's not woke or wasteful.
So the source frames this whole area research talent as a kind of zero-sum situation.
Exactly. Where, from their perspective, the U.S. wants to be the world leader, not fall behind China, especially in something critical like agricultural innovation. It really reinforces this theme in the source of global competition heating up across multiple sectors.
Right, not just trade, but talent, research.
Manufacturing, yeah.
Okay, finally, the source brings up China's messaging on the global stage and how that plays into a perception presented in the source of U.S. weakness.
It points to a specific message from China, asking the U.S. to maintain stability in the international financial system. This was apparently after Moody's downgraded U.S. bonds.
And the source's interpretation of that message.
Quite direct. They see it as China trolling the U.S.
Yeah.
That's the word they use. Attempting to position themselves as the voice of reason globally, and essentially suggesting the U.S. needs to, quote, chill out a little bit, maybe with less tweeting. That's the source's commentary on the statement.
Okay.
The source also makes a broader point about other countries showing independence, prioritizing their own interests more.
Like who?
They mentioned Japan, quoting Prime Minister Ashiba as saying he's not worried about fake deadlines, just focused on what's best for Japan. And India, quoting its foreign minister saying deals must benefit India, not just be dependent on the U.S.
So this highlights the source's view that nations are increasingly asserting their own agendas, maybe less constrained by U.S. influence than before.
That seems to be the argument, yes.
Yeah.
And the source's overall conclusion, kind of pulling all these threads together, is that the U.S. has been made, quote, utterly weak, and, in this source's opinion, doesn't fully understand the international order as it currently exists. A very stark conclusion presented in this material.
So, okay, pulling back from this deep dive into the source material, we've seen a picture emerge, painted by this specific analysis, of global powers apparently navigating perceived U.S. uncertainty.
Forging new connections, focusing on domestic strength, competing internationally across trade, tech, travel, research.
Right. We've looked at specific examples drawn directly from the source. Those high-level meetings between European leaders and China, the reported shifts in airline routes away from the U.S., that competition for talent and agricultural innovation.
So, based purely on the information and interpretations presented in this source, here's something maybe worth considering for you, the listener.
Yeah.
If these reported shifts in relationships, priorities, perceptions, if they continue along the lines described here, how might the global landscape fundamentally transform in the coming years? And what could the long-term implications be for everything from, say, global cooperation and economic competition to even something really personal, like where people choose to travel or, get their education?